3 a.m. London, 1897. A scream pierces the silence. Inside the grandest mansion in England, servants rush to the master bedroom. They find Edward Thornton, the richest merchant in London, sitting on the floor. Shaking. Covered in sweat. "Sir. What happened? Are you hurt?" Edward looks at them with wild, terrified eyes. "The walls, they're closing in. I can't breathe. But the room is massive. 40 feet wide. Nothing is moving. The doctor is called. He examines Edward. Finds nothing wrong. 'Sir, you're perfectly healthy.' Then why, Edward whispers, do I feel like I'm dying every single night? For 427 nights in a row, the richest man in England has been living in hell. And nobody knows why. This is the true story of a man who had everything, and how one conversation with a poor stable keeper revealed a secret that changed his life forever. 10 years ago, Edward was different. A young merchant. Ambitious. Working 16-hour days at the London docks. His father pulled him aside one day. "Son, I'm worried. You're obsessed. When will enough be enough?" Edward's answer was firm, "When I'm free. When money can never hurt us again." His father sighed. "Be careful what you chase, Edward. Sometimes you catch it." Edward didn't understand. Not then. He pushed harder. Built his shipping empire. Defeated competitors. Made impossible deals. At 42, he sold part of his company to the Queen's treasury. £180,000. An unimaginable fortune. The day the money arrived, Edward stood in his new mansion. Looked around at the marble floors. The crystal chandeliers. The silk curtains. Finally, he thought. Now I can rest. That night, he went to bed feeling victorious. 2 hours later, he woke up. Heart pounding. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't explain why. He thought it was just excitement. Tomorrow will be better. But tomorrow was worse. And the day after. And the day after that. Something was terribly wrong. But what? Week after week, the condition only got worse and worse. Edward hired the very best doctors in all of London. They examined him with great care and told him that his heart was strong, his lungs were perfect, and there was nothing physically wrong with him at all. Edward shouted back, asking why he could not sleep. The doctors had no answer for him. They prescribed laudanum, warm baths, and special herbal teas, but nothing worked at all. Every single night, the same terror would repeat. He would lie down and close his eyes, and then suddenly a loud bang would echo from downstairs. Edward would bolt upright in bed, convinced that thieves were coming for his gold. He would grab a fireplace poker and run downstairs, frantically searching every room. But there was nothing there, just his imagination playing cruel tricks. He would go back to bed and close his eyes again. Then his mind would fill with horrible images of his ship sinking in storms, his warehouses burning to ashes, his fortune being stolen, and his family begging in the streets. 3 in the morning would pass, then 4, then 5, and he would still be wide awake. His wife Catherine would beg him desperately to see someone, saying that this was not normal. Edward would lie and say he was fine, that he was just adjusting to his new life. But he was not fine at all. In fact, he was getting much, much worse. He started losing weight rapidly. His hands shook constantly. During important business meetings, his mind would wander off completely, and he would forget crucial things. His business partners began to notice, asking if he was well and saying he did not seem like himself anymore. One morning, after yet another completely sleepless night, Edward made a desperate decision. If doctors could not help him, then maybe he needed to leave London entirely, go somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from the money and the pressure. He walked into his garden, planning to tell his wife that they should travel and start over somewhere simple. That is when he heard it. The sound of whistling, happy and carefree whistling. Edward followed the sound to his stables, and there he saw something that stopped him completely cold. His stable keeper, Thomas, a man who made barely £50 a year, was brushing the horses and actually singing out loud. Edward just stood there, frozen in place, watching in disbelief. Thomas looked peaceful, content, and genuinely happy. Edward could not remember the last time he had felt any of those things himself. He whispered to himself, asking how this was even possible. He watched Thomas work for a full 10 minutes. The old man moved slowly and deliberately, took breaks whenever he needed to, and talked to the horses as if they were his dear friends. There was no stress, no fear, no panic whatsoever. Finally, Edward could not take it anymore and walked over. He called out Thomas's name. Thomas jumped in surprise, apologizing for not hearing him approach. Edward took a deep breath and said he needed to ask something, and that he needed complete honesty. Thomas said of course he would be honest. Edward asked the question that sounded completely insane even as it left his mouth. He asked if Thomas slept well at night. Thomas blinked in confusion at the strange question, then smiled gently and said that he slept like a baby every single night, 8 full hours, and thanked the Lord for it. Then he asked why Edward was asking such a thing. Edward felt something crack inside his chest. This man who had almost nothing slept perfectly, while Edward who had everything was dying inside. His voice broke as he asked how this was possible. He said that he had everything while Thomas had, forgive him for saying it, almost nothing. Yet Thomas slept soundly and Edward could not for months now. He desperately asked what was wrong with him. Thomas looked at the wealthy man standing before him and could see the desperation, the exhaustion, and the fear so clearly. He asked if he could tell Edward something that his father had once told him. Edward nodded eagerly, desperate for anything that might help. Thomas said to come and sit with him. They sat down on hay bales in the stable, the richest man in London and a poor stable keeper sitting side by side. Thomas began by explaining that his father had been a coal miner who died at the age of 45 from black lung disease. He was the poorest man in their entire village. But Thomas said that every night before he died, his father slept like a child with a smile on his face. Thomas had asked him once, just before he passed away, how he could possibly be at peace with so little. His father had looked at him and said he would tell him 3 secrets, 3 things he knew that rich men always forget. Edward leaned forward intently, listening as if his very life depended on it, because perhaps it truly did. Thomas said the first secret was that his father knew exactly why he woke up each morning. His father had told him that every single day, he went down into that dark mine and dug coal so that his family could eat. He knew his purpose, and simple as it was his own, and that knowledge let him sleep peacefully. He had said that rich men pile up gold but forget why they even wanted it in the first place. They chase wealth endlessly but lose their purpose completely, and a man without purpose can never truly rest. Edward felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. He could not remember the last time he had known his own why. Thomas continued, saying the second secret was that his father knew that enough was enough. His father had said that he had a roof over his head, food on his table, and his family by his side. Was it grand? No, it was not. But it was enough for him. The disease of wanting more and more has absolutely no cure, his father had said. It only grows and grows. He had seen rich men with 10 houses still desperately wanting an 11th. That was not wealth at all. That was a sickness. Edward thought about his own mansion, his 3 estates, his ships crossing the oceans. Was any of it enough? Had it ever truly been enough? Thomas said softly that the third secret was that his father knew his worth was not measured by his money. His father's very last words to Thomas had been that when he was laid in the ground, nobody would ask how much gold he had accumulated. They would ask only if he was kind, if he was faithful, and if he loved others well. That was the only wealth that could follow you beyond the grave. Thomas looked directly at Edward and asked, with great respect but also boldness, when was the last time Edward had known his own why? Edward opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out at all. He simply could not remember. That night, Edward lay in bed once again, but this time different thoughts haunted him instead. He thought back carefully to why he had wanted wealth in the first place. He remembered wanting security, wanting to provide for his family, and wanting to matter in the world. But now, what about now? He had security but was completely terrified. He provided for his family but barely even knew them anymore. He mattered in society but felt utterly empty inside. Then a thought hit him like a physical blow, a terrible and shocking thought. What if he had won the race but had been running in completely the wrong direction the entire time? He sat up in bed and looked around his enormous bedroom, at the silk, the gold, the luxury everywhere. All of this was supposed to make him happy, but he had never been more miserable in his entire life. He thought about Thomas sleeping peacefully in his small room above the stables. And suddenly, Edward finally saw the truth with perfect clarity. He had been chasing comfort his whole life, but comfort was not the same thing as peace. He had the softest bed that money could possibly buy, but comfort without purpose was just emptiness, just a beautiful prison. Thomas had a hard cot to sleep on, but he had purpose, and purpose gave him peace. For the first time in many months, Edward truly understood. He was not sick, and he was not broken. He was lost. He had built an entire empire but had lost himself completely in the process of building it. He had climbed to the very top of the mountain only to realize it was the wrong mountain all along. Edward got out of bed and walked slowly to his study. He looked at all his certificates on the walls, his awards, his undeniable proof of success. He whispered to the empty room, asking what it was all for, what the point of any of it was. And for the first time in 10 long years, Edward Thornton broke down completely and cried. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief, because finally he understood what was wrong. The next morning, he knew exactly what he had to do. Edward went back to the stables and found Thomas working. He told Thomas that he wanted to learn from him, to teach him how to sleep again. Thomas smiled gently and said he could not teach anyone to sleep, but he could help Edward find his why again. Over the next several weeks, something truly incredible began to happen. Edward did not give away his fortune, but he completely changed what he did with it and why. He opened a charity school in East London. For the first time in many years, he had a real reason to wake up every morning. 20 children were depending on him to teach them and give them hope. He hired men from the workhouses, gave them real wages and real dignity, and watched them slowly rebuild their shattered lives. He felt something he had not felt in years, which was real pride, not from profit, but from having genuine purpose. Every single morning before he even looked at his business ledgers, he asked himself one simple question. What is my purpose today? And every single day, he actually had a real answer. He started having tea with his young son, really talking and really listening to him. His son was 10 years old, and Edward realized with absolute horror that he barely knew his own child at all. He asked his son to tell him about school, to tell him everything. His son, shocked that his father was actually interested, slowly began to open up. Edward volunteered at the local parish, bringing food to struggling families. He did not do it for reputation or recognition, but because it gave him something no business deal ever could, which was meaning. And slowly, so incredibly slowly, something that seemed almost miraculous began to happen. He started sleeping again. 6 months passed. Edward could now sleep 8 full hours. One morning, he woke naturally with no panic, just genuine rest. He walked to the stables and found Thomas feeding the horses. Edward told him he had slept 8 hours. Thomas grinned, saying Edward had found his why again. Edward said something had been bothering him. He had started with good intentions, wanting to provide for his family and give them security. So what went wrong? Thomas thought carefully and said his father had taught him that the problem was not wanting wealth itself, but forgetting why you wanted it. Edward had started with noble reasons, but somewhere along the way, the gold became the goal itself, not the tool. Edward nodded slowly. He had become a slave to wealth instead of its master. Thomas said exactly. Edward used to use money to serve his purpose, but then money became his purpose. That was when he lost his peace. Edward looked at his mansion in the distance. It looked smaller now. He told Thomas that 6 months ago he thought he was the richest man in London, but he was wrong. Thomas had always been richer because he had what money could never buy. Thomas smiled humbly. He said both of them were rich now, just in different ways. Edward had comfort and contentment. Edward smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in years. Edward and Thomas developed a deep friendship. One morning, Edward asked why Thomas had helped him. Thomas asked if Edward knew his father's greatest regret. His father had worked alongside a rich mine owner's son who was miserable and anxious, exactly like Edward. His father never said anything, thinking it was not his place. 3 months later, that young man took his own life. Thomas's father never forgave himself for staying silent. He made Thomas promise to never stay silent if he saw someone suffering, no matter how rich. When Thomas saw Edward asking about sleep, he saw that same desperation. He thought, not again, not on my watch. Edward felt tears rolling down his face. He said Thomas had saved his life. Thomas shook his head, saying Edward had saved his own life. He just needed someone to point the direction. Years later, Edward died peacefully at 73. At his funeral, hundreds came. Not business partners, but the children he taught, the men he hired, the families he helped. Standing in front was 82-year-old Thomas. After the funeral, someone asked what Edward's secret had been. Thomas said Edward learned 3 things. First, money is a tool, not a purpose. Second, enough is a decision, not a number. Third, your worth is not your wealth. When you are gone, nobody remembers your bank account, only your heart. Those lessons gave Edward something no gold ever could. Peace. Right now, someone listening is chasing money, thinking once they have enough, they will be happy. But here is the secret. Enough is never enough, until you decide it is. The difference is the answer to 3 questions. Why do I work? What is enough? What will I be remembered for? Edward had every comfort money could buy, but could not sleep because comfort without purpose is just expensive suffering. Thomas had a hard cot but slept like a baby because he knew his why. Money can buy you a bed, but only purpose can help you sleep in it. So tonight, ask yourself. Do you know your why? Do you know what is enough? Do you know what you want to be remembered for? Because the richest person is not the one with the most money. It is the one who can sleep peacefully at night. And that is priceless.